Hey everyone, Steve Miller here with an Asia Now feature from the September 18th edition of Asia News Weekly. In this podcast, Rand Corporation's Scott Harold returns to discuss Vietnam's new policy of force in the South China Sea. It's no secret that tensions in the South China Sea run high. While the most vocal critic of Beijing's behavior tends to be the Philippines, with the United States slowly stepping up its disapproval, the nation that really butted heads the most over the past year is Vietnam. If you recall, last year China moved in the Haiyang Shi Yao 981 oil rig into Vietnam's Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. China supported this action with a massive fleet of over 100 vessels. Vietnam tried to repel the platform by sending its Coast Guard, but to no avail. Chinese vessels bumped and ground, forcing them back. If Vietnamese fishing vessels made the mistake of challenging China, the results were sometimes catastrophic. Now Vietnam looks to avoid a similar situation and has authorized its Coast Guard to use weapons to chase away foreign vessels entering the country's waters illegally. This new order is set to take effect on October 20th. To dive into the ramifications, I recently spoke with Scott Harold, Deputy Director of the Rand Corporation's Center for Asia-Pacific Policy. I began our conversation by asking for clarification on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provision that allows for passage through EEZs and how it relates to the South China Sea Code of Conduct.
It depends on the exact wording, and I haven't seen the exact wording, but I have seen the news reporting on this. And it seemed to suggest that what Vietnam was authorizing its Coast Guard to do was to use force against vessels that enter into Vietnamese territorial waters. Now, the territorial waters of any country are sovereign waters and can be policed by the country as they fit. Most countries would seek to use less than lethal force, and I suspect even the Vietnamese don't fire first and then ask questions. But as we have seen in even this week, there have been a number of incidents recently where Vietnamese fishermen have been fired upon in Vietnamese waters. And in fact, that just happened early this week off the southwest coast of Vietnam, near the border with Cambodia. An unidentified vessel took shots at and actually killed a Vietnamese fisherman while on his own boat. So I think that this is an issue inside of Vietnam, and of course, knowing as you do very well, the situation in Vietnam, where a communist party is also on the hook to prove its nationalist credentials, just like in China. The notion that you are going to kind of take it on the chin and not respond, that could be a very risky proposition if you're looking to maintain those nationalist credentials. So I think the government in Vietnam, which has, of course, been put under much more substantial pressure than the government in China as a consequence of neighbors using force to enforce their claims over and against your claims. The government in Vietnam may therefore feel itself to be under some substantial pressure and therefore may be pushing to send a signal, deterrent, or even, in the case of having to execute such threats towards its neighbors, to say, look, these are Vietnamese waters. We're not looking to fire first, but we're not looking to allow you to basically steal our maritime proteins, fish, and other kinds of wildlife caught at sea, and we're going to defend them. Is it commensurate with UNCLOS? It would not be commensurate with the Exclusive Economic Zone, I think, because countries are at least advised to treat those as areas where other vessels are allowed to transit. They're not allowed to take the resources out. So if it was a policing issue in that sense, I suppose it would be commensurate with UNCLOS. But in terms of the ASEAN-China Declaration of parties to the conflict over the South China Sea, their countries were enjoined to de-escalate and to not take any provocative actions. And so in this case, if the Vietnamese were doing anything that was highly provocative, which would not normally be seen in the form of a police action by a Coast Guard, unless it was something particularly egregious, then if the Vietnamese did do something that was particularly egregious, I suppose you could argue that it was not commensurate with the DOC. The declaration of conduct, however, has been most egregiously violated by the Chinese repeatedly with their artificial island construction, which is now leading to the emplacement of military facilities in the deepest reaches of the South China Sea and the Spratlys.
Well, let's talk about China, because last year they did move that oil rig into Vietnamese waters. China claims most of the South China Sea as their sovereign territory, which does overlap with other countries. And a lot of people have said that this Vietnamese issuance of this order is in response to last year's conflict. But if you're going to issue an order to use force, you have to also be willing to back it up. And it's one thing to go against a small vessel that's firing upon a fishing vessel. But does Vietnam have what it takes to actually follow through if China goes into what it deems is its sovereign territory?
It's an excellent question. I think the reality is that even with countries as mismatched in size and capabilities as China and Vietnam, it's never the case that you can prejudge the outcome of a potential conflict in advance, even though the Vietnamese would look on paper to be seriously overmatched. We all know that Vietnam has basically striven to free itself from Chinese hegemony and Chinese domination. It's the overriding theme in Vietnamese history. The Vietnamese fought the Chinese to basically a standstill in 1979, and people fight wars because they don't know the outcome. They think they will know the outcome, but they can't know for sure, and the other side doesn't agree. Moreover, there is an element of raising the costs to anyone in this, which has a deterrent aspect to it, right? So if the Vietnamese essentially signal that, hey, we're ready to use force if you, the Chinese, or any other country come back and try and take by force what is ours, it then forces the other side to reevaluate and say, are we really willing to escalate to that level? Are we willing to fire upon them? Are we willing to be fired upon? And if you look at what the Vietnamese did last summer when the Chinese emplaced that Haiyang Shiyo 981 drilling platform, that semi-submersible drilling platform in the northern reaches of the South China Sea that was in waters that Vietnam claimed, the Vietnamese contested that very vigorously for a period of 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that.
Well, yeah, like a month. Like a month,
yeah,
and they sent their own Coast Guard vessels out there. There's bumping between ships. Several fishing vessels also sunk.
And the Vietnamese showed that despite China's superior size and military capabilities, they were not willing to simply allow this to happen. And they made China pay a very substantial price in a number of ways. First, in the global media, this was a hot story for the duration of that period. The visuals coming out were very deleterious to China's image. It showed Chinese vessels basically running down small, lightly armed or even unarmed Vietnamese vessels. So there was a reputational price to be paid. Moreover, there was an actual physical challenge, right? China actually had to field the sufficient number of vessels to keep that semi-submersible rig defended against Vietnamese maritime police forces. And that's quite costly because each of those vessels has to be staffed, has to be put to sea, has to be maintained. The operating costs were quite substantial. And so the Vietnamese, by showing that they would not simply accept what China had done, forced China to pay a more substantial cost. Now, if you were to say, in addition to us being willing to contest this position, as the Vietnamese have been willing to say in the past, now we're going to do so, and we're going to do it in a way that authorizes us to use force. Now the Chinese it basically forces them to factor in another wild card. Okay, maybe the Vietnamese will stand up, but maybe they're going to fire on us. So now we have to up armor all of our vessels. We have to be prepared to explain to our people why we put them at risk. We have to be prepared to explain to our nation and the families of those members who are serving on Chinese vessels, if anyone is killed, why their lives were lost. So I think it has a substantial cost potentially for China if the Vietnamese are aiming first and foremost at China. But bear in mind, as I said earlier this week, there was an unnamed national boat, or a boat of unnamed national origin to Vietnam's southwest that fired on these Vietnamese fishermen. That could be a Cambodian boat. There are occasionally spats between Cambodia and Vietnam. The current and long-standing Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen is seen to be very favorable towards Vietnam, since his government had its origins in the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978-79. But there is a widespread frustration in Cambodia with the Vietnamese. And so Vietnam could be sending signals to multiple audiences with this announcement.
Do you think that other claimant nations within the South China Sea, specifically ASEAN nations, do you think they'll follow Vietnam's lead and issue similar directives?
Well, I'm not sure that I haven't looked specifically at the legal guidance given to maritime law enforcement officials in Southeast Asia. But if we remember back a few years ago, there was a spat between the Philippines and Taiwan because a Taiwanese fishing vessel had entered into what the Filipinos deemed to be their either national waters or exclusive economic zone. And the Filipinos fired on and killed a Taiwanese fisherman, which led to an enormous brouhaha in the relationship. There was an investigation that was basically forced upon the Philippines by the fact that Taiwan severed all sorts of contacts and was threatening to not authorize overseas Filipino worker visas, which, of course, the Philippines derives an enormous portion of its national tax revenues and national income from Filipinos going abroad to seek work, including in Taiwan. And the Taiwanese were very, very angry because this fisherman was apparently not given any warning and was just fired upon without any pre-alerting that, hey, we regard this as our waters, now move away or else. And so I think, that is an issue that we have seen elsewhere in the South China Sea. Or what the Vietnamese would call the East Vietnam Sea, or the Filipinos would call the West Philippine Sea. We could see it conceivably in other parts of Southeast Asia. Those would be kind of, the Thais, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, the Singaporeans. But to date, the Indonesians, for example, have been very concerned about intrusions into their waters. I heard a figure recently, an Indonesian official figure, that the Indonesians estimate they lose $30 billion in maritime assets through theft. And I'm not sure what that period of time was over. It would be hard to imagine that would be in the course of a year. But a very substantial number. They clearly regard maritime law enforcement as a very high priority. The Singaporeans, of course, as a trading nation, have to regard the security around their island as of the utmost importance, but maybe a little bit less concerned about the loss of fish, since Singapore is not primarily dependent on aquaculture. But the Thais and the Malaysians certainly have large parts of their coastline where fishing villages are of great importance to local economies. And so I think you could see this issue remain at the forefront for a little while. But hopefully, since most of the countries in the region don't regard each other as primary threats to their security, hopefully it won't be at the forefront of their policy agendas. The real question for most of these countries is either a domestic challenge in the case of most of Southeast Asia, or for the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, increasingly a concern about what would China do to us, what of our claimed maritime areas will China seek to take by force.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of leads me into this last question I want to ask you. If this issuance of this order does make China reevaluate its strategy in terms of how to address Vietnam and perhaps the Philippines later on, is something like this exactly what's needed to kind of get the parties back at the table to finally ratify that code of conduct for the South China Sea?
Oh, tough question to end on. Well, I mean, in other words, if I rephrase the question is, after having for years tried to get to the negotiating table through polite requests and through diplomatic signaling, is the reality that China only understands force and can only be forced to come back to the negotiating table through threats. Everyone would like to believe that's not the case, but certainly at present, on a whole host of issues, everything ranging from maritime disputes to cyberspace, we have yet to see a request for negotiations to lead to a resolution be an approach that has much appeal to China. And so if I can draw an analogy here, we've seen President Obama say in recent days that the administration will not lose. If the Chinese refuse interminably to negotiate norms in cyberspace, and if we have to go the route of each side doing whatever it wants to, the U.S. would be prepared to win. And that's, I think, also a type of signaling to Beijing that, you know what, you think that you can ignore all of us. If you think that you can ignore all of our requests, whether it's in cyberspace or 9-line maritime claims, whatever, and just go about taking what you want by dint of your size and your perceived self-importance and maybe your global importance, there will be costs to pay for that, and you will come out worse. And so at least for a number of important actors, Vietnam, the United States, others, it unfortunately appears to be the case that in at least a few important areas, China has yet to recognize that its neighbors and diplomatic partners' demands are serious and can't be ignored. That's a kind of a more nuanced answer than straight yes or no. I'm just thinking that in the back of my head, there are areas where China has been cooperative. For example, to some extent, not by any means as much as we would like, but to some extent on Iran, China has done some things. Now, many of those things that China has done on Iran's nuclear program had to be extracted through pressure on China. But they could probably have made things even more difficult than they did. So I don't want to say that there's a yes or a no answer in the totality of Chinese foreign and security policy, but quite clearly China seeks to preserve what it perceives to be its own interests very firmly and doesn't cooperate out of good spirit.
All right. Scott Harold is a full political scientist and deputy director at the Center for Asia Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, Steve. Take care.
What I'd like to know from you is this. Do you think Vietnam has the will to push back against China, and will this lead to armed skirmishes? This episode of Asia Now features extended content of material originally broadcast as part of the Asian News Weekly podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please drop us an email message. That address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.